All right, well, we're going to get started. My name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature Organization, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Iowa City Book Festival. All of our events this year are online, so if you missed anything, you can catch up by visiting iowicitybookfestival.org for links to past events. This year's festival is supported by the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, and Iowa Public Radio. While our current situation has been challenging, it has afforded new opportunities. We're able to gather authors from various locations and bring them together through the magic of the internet. And this is one of those occasions. Here we welcome Ice Cube Press publisher Steve Simkin, who will introduce 4 authors of recent titles from the press, and they will appear here in just a moment. If you have a question at any time during our program, click the Ask a Question text below the video, and you will have the opportunity to type in a question and submit that, and Steve will be monitoring those to ask at the end of our program. In addition, if you click the green Buy a Book/Donate button, you will be taken to a page with links to Ice Cube Press, as well as to information about how to donate to the City of Literature Organization, which helps our ability to present free programming like the Iowa City Book Festival. And now I would like to turn things over to Steve, and he will introduce our authors.
All right. Great, John. Thanks for, first off, as we do with everything, we thank everybody for taking the time to come and see us and listen. I was thinking the other day, obviously the world has changed a lot, but one thing that never gets old for me anyway is no matter how we go about it, is the chance to share and introduce and let other people discover the talented authors that I deal with almost every single day. And I'm really happy to have these 4. It's been I think in some ways for each of them, it's been an extra challenge to go through this, and they're probably much more used to virtual events than I am at this point. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly a real thing. I love doing these kind of events where we can kind of go through and introduce authors, because a lot of the times what you want to know most about a book and an author is who wrote it. And this is a great opportunity for you to get to know some people. A couple things about how we'll set it up is we're going to have the 4 authors, and we're going to go about an hour. So we're going to divide them up in about 10, 12-minute segments. And we're going to have questions. And one of the cool things about doing it this way is we're going to take questions at the end, but you can ask your questions along the way. There's a way on the system that we're using to ask questions, and then we're going to be checking those along the way. And then when we get towards the end, we'll go through those questions and ask people. And if you have one for a particular author, great. If you have one for all of them, that's fine too. They can go through and answer them. We're going to start with Thomas Cook, who wrote Clubfoot. Then we're going to go to David Perkins, who, from my point of view, it's really fun to have someone from out of our time zone. So I got to write Central Time for him because he's out of Colorado. And we're going to go to David Bluder and then to Barb Feller. And I'll just say a quick thing about each author along the way, just who they are. And so let's get this started, right? You're not here to listen to me. But anyway, I've been running the Ice Cube Press since 1991. And I never expected that I'd still be in business. And I certainly didn't expect that I'd be doing things this way. But I'm actually kind of think it's fun. So Professor Thomas Cook is a physical therapist, biomedical engineer, global health expert, and Fulbright scholar. He's director of global operations for the Ponseti International Association, a founding member of the Rotarian Action Group for Clubfoot, a co-founder for the nonprofit Clubfoot Solutions, and one of the developers of the Iowa Brace. Tom was fortunate to know and work with Dr. Ignacio Ponseti for several years, and as you may have assumed, his book is entitled Clubfoot. And with that, I will pass it on to him. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and thanks to the organizers of this event and the Iowa City Book Festival and the opportunity to talk a little bit about the book that I spent a good part of about 4 years of my life writing. I can tell you that when I first decided to write this book, people always said, "Oh, it takes at least 3 years to write a book." I said, "Oh, no way! I'll just sit down and write it." It took 4 years, so those people were right, and maybe I was a little slower than average. Steve asked to cover three topics, and that is who I am, and I think he read the flap on the book saying that I've been associated with the University of Iowa now for going on 40 years in physical therapy and public health. Had the opportunity over that time to work in 45 or so different countries, to spend some time living in the Slovak Republic, and to get a feel for what's happening around the world, particularly related to the medical community and to rehabilitation. At the same time, I was fortunate enough to work with Dr. Ignacio Ponseti for starting actually initially in the early 90s, and then more intensely the last 10 or so years of his life, beginning around the year 2000. So that's who I am, and I've been very interested, of course, in rehabilitation and disability and those sorts of issues. Why did I write the book? I wrote the book because Clubfoot is a global problem. It affects some 200,000 infants every year who are born with this congenital problem. Their feet are turned in and turned under, and makes it very difficult for them to walk. It's a very limiting disability. In the U.S. and in developed countries, it's kind of a hidden disability because it gets treated, kids get treated as infants, but not so in the developing world, where about 160,000 of these children somehow may or may not be treated and have their deformity corrected, and may spend their life fairly miserable with the inability to walk. You know, in developing countries, if you can't walk, you can't work, you can't get to school, you can't do a lot of things. So the motivation was obvious, is that there's a need to tell the story about Clubfoot, and simultaneously to tell the incredibly interesting story of Dr. Ponseti and his life, and how he came up with this treatment that is now the gold standard around the world, in which we've been working since 2006 through the Ponseti International Association to promote to those in need. So the book is really sort of divided into three parts. The first part is very biographical in terms of Dr. Ponseti's life. Very interesting. He was born on a Spanish island in the Mediterranean. He was a good student. He grew up in Barcelona, was exposed to arts and culture and music, but was fascinated with biology. And at his core, he was a biologist. He went to medical school because of his interest in biology. He did very well in medical school. Unfortunately, he graduated from medical school on a Friday in 1936, and the next day, the Spanish Civil War broke out. So he instantly found himself as a Army surgeon right out of medical school. Spent 2.5 years in the Spanish Civil War, was on the losing side, had a harrowing escape into France as Franco's army was closing in. Spent about 5 months in a confinement camp, along with almost 500,000 of his Spanish colleagues who were driven out of Spain. Ended up in Mexico, since the Mexican government offered him citizenship. He worked as a general practice doctor in rural Mexico for about 2.5 years, and ultimately found his way to Iowa because he wanted to study orthopedics. And at the time, the orthopedics department in Iowa was one of the premier, if not the best, orthopedic department in the world. So by sheer happenstance, he was able to get a fellowship at the University of Iowa, came in 1941 on his 27th birthday, and had already lived a pretty full life at that point. And one of the first assignments that Dr. Steinler gave him was to look at the surgical outcomes of children that he had treated surgically for Clubfoot over the previous 15 years. He immediately found out that surgery was not the answer, that there were long-term problems, and decided there ought to be a better way. And he developed a non-surgical series of cast and manipulations that he was able to show correct the Clubfoot in 4 to 6 weeks, starting even in early infancy, and much better long-term outcome, which he documented many times. The other interesting part, the third part of the book, is the story of what we call the quest, and that is he had the answer. He had a better way to treat these hundreds of thousands of children every year, but couldn't convince the medical community to take it on. And he spent literally 40 years publishing papers, promoting this technique, going nowhere with it because the medical community was enamored with surgery and just wouldn't listen. The fortunate thing is that around the turn of the century, late 1990s and 98, in fact, he started putting information on the burgeoning internet. And when parents heard that there was an alternative to surgery for correcting clubfoot, they started coming to Iowa. They forced their doctors to come to Iowa to learn about it. And since then, the last 20 years, there's been this organization that we have here at Iowa, the Ponseti International Association, directed at promoting that technique, teaching healthcare people around the world to treat these kids. The beauty of the technique is that it only requires plaster and a skilled physician. And plaster is about as cheap a medical commodity as you could think of. And we're working in 70 or 80 countries, in fact, publicizing all we can everywhere to train physicians and other healthcare people to apply this technique. So the last part of the book is about that effort in multiple countries to spread this technique and to promote it to help these kids wherever they might be in the remotest of areas. And that's been challenging, and you can imagine in very low resource poor countries, but certainly rewarding and effective. And we still have a long way to go to teach this technique, to find enough healthcare people who have the time and to learn the technique and the interest in doing it, given what else is going on in their country. But it's really a fascinating story. It's a tribute to Dr. Ponseti, who overcame incredible obstacles through his whole life: the Spanish War, the exile, the medical community that would ignore him for so long, but ultimately prevailed and ultimately came up with a technique that is now on the rise globally and is considered the gold standard by medical associations all over the world, and is continued to this day to move forward. So that's what the book is about. It's about Dr. Ponseti, it's about the technique, and it's about this quest to publicize this technique globally. Steve, back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I when I first found out about this book, I was like a lot of people, like maybe not like a lot of people, but I'm always fascinated at how little I know in some ways, because he had come to me and I didn't really have that much idea who Dr. Ponseti was. And of course, as soon as I started reading about it, I realized what an incredible person he was and how much, when you say, you sit down and write a book in no time, well, of course, it takes 4 years and it shows in this case. Did a really masterful job. And I know that you can't mention everything in a short talk like that, but this book has a lot of ties to the Rotary Club, and it's one of their international causes. And when you read the book, you'll find out a lot more about how that's all related. Okay, and our next person up is David Perkins. And like I mentioned, I never know how I'm going to get my next book idea. And this one was brought to me by a friend of mine in Chicago. And I knew we were going to work just fine together as soon as he wanted some Kandinsky artwork for his cover. And so from that point on, I was like, we're going to be good. And so David Perkins is out of Denver, Colorado. And I'm going to do the generic reading of the book flat, because if I start making stuff up, you don't know what I'll say about you. He has spent a life inside books. He's owned 2 bookstores in Denver, Colorado, and then moved to Philadelphia to go into publishing at Running Press and Westminster Press, then on to New York with Oxford University Press. From there to being assistant press director at the University of Illinois Press, and back to the East Coast as associate press director at Georgetown University Press. And I will say there's a world in the university, within university presses, that maybe not everybody knows, but it's very I would call it enlightening. There's so many interesting topics, and there's so many passionate people about their little part of understanding that I find it really fascinating. He's had hundreds of book reviews, various articles, essays, and poetry published. And he is into Tchaikovsky, and I know he's into cats, and he has one called Mr. Pete's. And also, there's some illustrations in the book by Jay Miller, who's a friend of David's as well. I hope that he reads some poetry, and so that I don't take up too much of your time, I'm going to pass it on over to you, David, and disable my camera and my mic now.
Hey, hello there. Thank you very much for inviting me. The story of how this book came to be is quite strange. Here it is, by the way. It's a wonderful Kandinsky on the cover, I might add. I've been writing it all my life, ever since I was small. As soon as I could hold a book on my own, I started reading poetry and writing it. And if you're not interested in my book, then if you have children or grandchildren, get them a copy of Favorite Poems, Old and New by Helen Ferris. I lived inside this book when I was small. My mother and I would sit on the front porch and read them out loud. And this is how it all started. And as Steve may have mentioned, he asked us to talk about ourselves. When I ask to talk about ourselves, I like to quote Emily Dickinson. That's, "I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise, you know." But my background has been in books, and I continued to write poetry all my life because I enjoyed doing it. I never really tried to get much published. It's one of the things that gives me great pleasure. So anyway, Bruce Miller, Steve's friend that he mentioned, saw some of them, and he said, "You need to put together a manuscript." And I said, "You're crazy, you're bats. Nobody's going to be interested in these." He insisted. So I dug through all my files, and I had some stuck in books and some in drawers, and they were just all over the place. I started pulling them all together, and I sent it to him. He said, "Please, I'll take it around to publishers." I said, "Okay, fine." So I sent him the manuscript. I expected that would be the end of it, that I would never hear anything about it again. Within 3 months, he had somehow twisted Steve's arm, and here it is. I could not be more astonished. So I continue to do it. And one of the reasons that Bruce wanted me to do it is he said that what I'm doing is not what you're seeing being published nowadays. It's different and it's fresh. And I love him for saying that, and I hope that it's true. But so manuscript just happened, and like I said, I couldn't be more amazed. What happened to Emily then would almost happen to me. She only published 7 poems in her lifetime, and she wrote over 1,776, and I'm closing in on that. But the rest of my life, as Steve mentioned, I owned bookstores. I worked in book publishing, and that's where I ran across Bruce. No one can tell you what poetry is, and poets have tried to explain what poems are over the centuries, and there's no final answer. I think if it touches you, if it makes a connection, then that is what poetry is. And he also mentioned that I've been an amateur Tchaikovsky scholar all my life, so Music is very important to me. The sounds of words, the alliteration, the assonance, um, and what I like to deal in is surprise rhyme. And I just do what I do, and I hope that people like it. I with my poems, I want to bring you in. I don't want to put obstacles in your way. I want the poem to be relatable to you in your first time reading it. And you can dig into it later if you want to find out more about, or to take a look at the references and the different levels of meaning they're in there. But I want you to be able to enjoy it on the first pass through. And I like to deal with what Yeats called the rag and bone shop of the heart. I don't want to confuse you. In a poem, The Yellow Wood, in my book, I have a line, I do not want the way to be too hard, but worth the effort. And I hope that's what it is. Now I am going to, poems come to me. I believe in the muse. The muse comes and drops a line in my head while I'm letting my brain idle, just going about our everyday things. And so I'm going to read one to you that came to me while I was brushing my teeth. And it's called That Someone There. Again, that someone there in the mirror, slumming, follows up on his promise to meet me here faithfully each morning in exchange for his freedom when I do not need him. He never speaks unless spoken to, and only says those things I already know. When he leaves, he doesn't tell me his destinations, nor when he reappears does he tell me where he's been. I only know that beyond the reflection behind me, he exits into a world that has no snow, no living to make, and no one to answer to. It has not stopped his aging, though. Sadly, he has time to go through, as all of us must do. I would save him from that if I could, but time is as much a necessity to his species as it is to mine. He meets me and passes no judgment anymore. We are far beyond that in our tortured relationship. And when dismissed, he visits a place far different from that which waits dully outside my door. It is, perhaps, to an unfallen Eden, a young lover, the coast of Spain, or to speak with luminaries, walk through Paris streets, or to meals with friends I will never meet. I envy him, not for his looks, of course, which are unfortunately fading and weren't much to begin with, but because he goes where they don't matter and never have, where meadows bloom in the laps of Matterhorns, where limousines whisk him safe from place to place, where music continues still from those composers who have stepped beyond this planet where I scuff my shoes. This is what I have promised him in return. I will not ask where he has been, and he will leave me to my imagining. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Nesco. It's been a wonderful experience. And I hope that you know I love you.
All right. Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the title of the book. I may or may not love you. There's no better way to start a book, in my opinion. I always do this little. If you get one of my books, you'll always see the very, very last page, and I would assume the authors notice it, but maybe not. I always do a little tribute to my daughter on the very last in little tiny letters, and I use the titles or the subjects of the book, and I assume they all figured that one out, but that was an especially easy one to use. All right, my camera will not stay still. All right, the next author up is David Bluder, and I think of the 4 authors on this group, he must be the most upset that his book came out during a time when virtual events were the primary way of doing things. Because the first time I met him was at a basketball game, Carver Hawkeye Arena, screaming out loud, talking to friends and fans all around the stadium. And he just loves to be out there with the people. And so I don't know how he's putting up with this whole thing as a book author and doing promotions, but I think he probably, of the 4 of us, of the 4 of you, maybe dealing with this may be kind of hard for him. David Bluder holds a degree in business from Northern Iowa University and received his MBA at St. Ambrose University. Before becoming an author, David was a banker, politician, business owner, and investor, as well as taught business policies at the University of Iowa. He currently lives with his wife, Lisa Bluder, who's been coaching at the University of Iowa women's basketball, probably 20 or 21 years, and she was the 2019 Naismith Coach of the Year, along with his 3 children. His book is entitled The Great Gamble, and it's a wide-reaching, I like to say it's balancing that line between fact and fiction. There's this, and he's going to talk about this, I'm sure, but the whole idea of the disruption of sports with gambling and sports betting. And when you start thinking about how all those things are getting intertwined over time, it makes for a hard to digest sports. Like as a sports fan, for me, I always love sports because the one thing I like about it is you don't know what's going to happen. And so I always took refuge in that. But this is his first novel, and he really knows a lot about all this. And so I think we'll pass it on over to David, and he will fill you in on what his book's all about. I'm not sure if he's there.
Are we here?
Yeah, you're here. I can hear you.
You can hear me.
Yeah, you might have to push the disable camera button.
How's that? Perfect.
Yeah, there you go.
Can you
You're
hear
good.
me now?
All right, I'm going
Terrific.
off.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Steve. It was fun. Yes, this has been a crazy time for everyone, and especially for me when I'd like to get out and talk to people about this unusual but secretive subject. I'd like to start with something that started chapter 25 in The Great Gamble. It's a quote by Mark Twain, and he says, quote, "Such is the human. Often it seems a pity that Noah didn't miss the boat." And The Great Gamble is a story about some of the problems that we create for ourselves. Approximately 10 years ago, I began an adventure thinking that I wanted to write a story, and it all started because I was hungry. Just as in Genesis 1, Adam was in the garden and he was hungry, and Eve told him it was okay to take a bite of the apple that God told him that he shouldn't be able to eat from the tree. And there was an old Hungarian proverb that says that Adam ate the apple and our teeth still hurt. It was the first human conflict, and it was from the garden that was off limits, and it was his decision, and he paid a major price for it as well as the rest of us. And that's what the novel is all about. If you remember the movie Indecent Proposal, Demi Moore was in dire straits. She was losing her wonderful dream house, and she decided to go to Las Vegas with her husband to try to win it back. In essence, she meets a gentleman by the name of Paul Newman, or Robert Redford, and he decides to give her $1 million to spend the evening with her, and in so doing, she'd be able to pay off her debts. She did, and her her financial problems were corrected for a while, but it created a major conflict with her marriage for the rest, and complicated things for the rest of her life. So the novel is about what price? What is the price that we pay? You may say that you wouldn't do the same thing that Demi Moore did. But if I had asked you a question, if your family was starving, you were out of a job, they were hungry, there was no way for you to feed them, would you steal a loaf of bread for them? It doesn't take you much time to think that, of course you would. So we would all do something based upon our situation. And our decisions sometimes come at a great price. And the great gamble, again, subtitle is At What Price? The novel, The Great Gamble, has been said to be one of the biggest secrets in America. It's about one of the top recruits in the country who's in high school. His name is Jason Carson. He lives with his mother. He's an immense man. He's 6'9". He has an incredible amount of skills. He's incredibly handsome. And he has been offered scholarships from hundreds and hundreds of schools in the United States. But he's in a big quandary. Single mother, has ovarian cancer, no health care. The two of them are about to lose their rundown home, or excuse me, apartment in Oak Park, Illinois. And enter Ricardo Perez. Ricardo is originally from Mexico, but he is an agent, and he's very sophisticated. He wears Armani suits. He has, he does yoga. He listens to classical music. He's a big fan of Mozart, for example. And he speaks 5 languages. Very brilliant man. He knows Jason has a problem and needs cash. And he's been following him, like many agents and many AAU coaches around the country. And he decides to give Jason a loan. And he gives Jason a loan for $30,000 so they can pay off their debt for his mother, who's, of course, dying. And it creates a small problem because Ricardo comes back about a couple weeks later after he gives him the money and says, you know, you're still in high school, you're playing Fenwick, which is a high school in Chicago. You beat him by 25 points last time. Can you just beat him by 15 or 20 this time? And after some time of discernment, of course, Jason agrees. And Jason is hooked. So there's a problem then that Jason then has where he begins to what's called shave points. Just the game specifically was supposed to be won by 20, let's say, but if it's won by less than 20 or 15, someone can win millions and millions of dollars. There's another protagonist. His name is called Tim McMurray. He's an egomaniac. He is a womanizer. He's divorced, has a couple kids, and he likes to say that his next wife hasn't even been born yet. He leads a life into the paranormal, the occult, he does seances and numerology. Very interesting, crazy life. And he also, being a referee, can change the outcomes of the games themselves. And he is being threatened daily by deadly and unthinkable ways. The Great Gamble has some subplots. There's a major art theft, one of the largest art thefts in the United States history. There's a discovery of a hidden area, which is in New York City. It's in a specific landmark that we all know about. There's an investigation into the famous crypto encryption, which is currently being used by the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. And there's some investigative ideas about encryptos and that and how that's being used actually becomes a big problem because it gets broken and hacked. There's a classified operation of an FBI into the FBI that leads into kind of the bleeding battlefield of gambling, both in the United States and then it runs abroad. So you get to go overseas and sees what's happening also. All this leads into numerology for the referee. And as Marv Cook, who endorsed the book, says, it's a journey stirred up images for him, which is a combination between pulp fiction meets Sicario. And it all leads to an explosive revelation that a sports fan will never be able to watch a game the same way again. So that's primarily what the Great Gamble is about. And I'll let you take it back. Thank you.
Right. All right. Perfect. Yeah, it's a like you say, it's at the front of his book of the Great Gamble. There's 4 photos at the beginning, which when you get a copy of this book, you're gonna start out by seeing these.
I do have it.
Yeah, the new there it
Yep.
is. Right.
Yeah.
And then there's one that they're all fascinating. You'll discover them. There's an art heist, but I really like the one on the title page with the Kryptos sculpture in front of the FBI. And if we have time at the end, maybe that'll be my question for you to talk a little bit about that, because that's another one of these things in life where I don't know things, and then I read them from other people, and I think, how did I make it this far in life without knowing about these things? I love how at some point you're like, how far-reaching is gambling? It's not just that kid getting money on the corner. It's back in there. It keeps going back and back.
Billions and billions of dollars.
Right. Yeah, and actually, I think we can use that segue for Barb Feller's book, because she the first time I did a book with her, I met her at the Marion Public Library at an author event, and I think that she didn't believe I would listen to her and actually take her idea for a book seriously, but I certainly did. Her first book was called The Road to Wabiek, and it's about J. Sigmund, and she would sort of offhandedly said, everything I do in life, almost all the roads lead to Wabiek. And I was like, okay, yeah, whatever you're talking about. But kind of like sports gambling taking over a lot, she has sort of proven to me that all roads do actually seem to lead to Wabiek. Her newest book is called The Creation of an Artist, and it's Grant Wood's boyhood story. And I think on the cover, Joanie Kinsey, who some of you may know, she says, a delightful short biography of Iowa's most famous artist. And almost all of us, as I'm sure she's going to point out, know about American Gothic. But there's a whole story behind Grant Wood becoming who he is, and it's always fascinating to me, especially when you consider that we're the city of literature and we sort of have a relationship to the world, is how Grant Wood became someone by focusing right here in Iowa and not too far from where we're all sitting right now, mostly, except for you, David Perkins, but you know about Grant Wood, so so I'll of course let her talk about it. But Barb was the lead educator at Grant Wood's studio at 5 Turner Alley in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And like I mentioned, her previous book, The Road to Wabiek, focused on area artist and author J. Sigmund. And I think she'll mention the ties to Jay and Grant Wood, and also Paul Engel, who some of you may know was one of the co-creators of the Iowa Workshop. So let me turn it over to Barb, she's got a presentation, and that's one of the reasons why we saved her for last. Okay, let's go ahead and turn it over. I'm going to disable my camera and mute my mic. I think you need...
Hello, everybody. This is going to be a real experiment as we try to show a picture as well. Are you seeing me?
Yeah, we've got you, Barb. Are you ready to jump into the presentation?
Yes. Yes.
All right.
Can you hear me okay? All right. As other people were introducing themselves, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I have been a teacher for a very long time. And for 25 years of that time, I worked in museums as an educator. One of my I first started working in museums when I moved to Iowa from New York State. Well, I lived in New York State and then Massachusetts and moved to Iowa. And so when I was working in the Lynn County History Center, I, of course, didn't feel that I was quite knowledgeable about the background of Iowa the way the other people were. But I did know how to teach. And what I wanted to do is set up a class for kids where they would learn how museums, how the archives specifically are used in museums, so that people would, the kids would be able to take advantage of this and learn about it. And my office happened to be in an archives at the History Center, so I went through it and I found this box about the poet J. Sigmund. I knew nothing about him, so I started trying to find out. I had a teacher in high school who started me out in becoming compulsive about research. And what she did was, this was American history in the AP class. She would pass around little slips of paper each week, and we would draw out this piece of paper and have to do research on the topic. The first one I had was transcendentalism. And I went up to her and I said, I can't do this because I don't even know what that means. And she said, that's exactly why you're going to do it. And I did. And it was about Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. I became so compulsive about learning about them after that experience and doing research on other things that in the end I ended up, when I got married, going on my honeymoon to see Ralph Waldo Emerson's house, of course.
Oh.
But this is a similar story. So my book is called Creation of an Artist, Grant Wood's Boyhood Story. And what I wanted to do is talk to people, talk to kids, let people know what was it in Grant Wood's childhood that made him into an artist. Okay, go ahead. Click. We're experimenting here with slides. There we go. This is what people know about Grant Wood. All around the world, I've traveled quite a lot, and I've seen some kind of a picture that looks like this in many ways, and it's been spoofed so many times that it's one of the most famous pieces of art in the entire world. What I've heard is it's one of the top 3, with Mona Lisa being number 1. Today, it even has modernized itself. If you click, you'll see the most modern version. They're up to date, just like the rest of us. This is the famous American Gothic couple painted by Grant Wood in 1930 that shot him to fame. But if you click, you will see the next picture is the one that got me started. It's not American Gothic. It's not a famous painting at all. It's just a simple painting of quilts. And the way I happened across it is as I was doing my research on the poet J. Sigmund, one of the board members from the Lynn County History Center told me that she knew J. Sigmund's daughter-in-law. And she said, you can come meet her. And her name was Virginia Sigmund Myers. She invited me up to her apartment, was brewing me some tea, and said, just make yourself at home. It was a very small little apartment in Cottage Grove Place in Cedar Rapids. And as I was looking on the walls, I saw this painting, and I said to her, this is kind of nice. I like it. I don't know much about art. It looks almost impressionist to me. And she said, take a closer look. Click. And as I did, if we do it too, can you click? Go to the next slide. As you get to seeing it closer, it turns out that Grant Wood is the artist. And when we get even closer, as we will now, you can see his signature, Grant Wood, Wabiek, Iowa, 1928. Well, here's Virginia with her picture. I thought it was really interesting. She told me the story. You can go to the next slide with Virginia.
I have it.
And she told me the story of how her father, they were probably together in the art museum, which was on the top floor of the library. Wood was a young kid probably at the time that they met, but he was in 1928 asked to do some work on what is some famous windows, the memorial windows in our Veterans Auditorium. And he was thinking about his style. He was going to go to Europe to find out about how to make glass, but he also makes stained glass. But he also kept thinking, I need to be like the Impressionist painters. I need to be like these people in France if I'm really going to be a true artist. And he was walking along with J. Sigmund along the Wapsipinicon River in Wabiek and saying, I just really don't feel like I can be that kind of a painter. I'm not sure what to do. And Jay gave him some advice. He said, just look around you. Like, look at those quilts hanging on the line right there. That's Iowa. That's what you know about. That's what you love. That's what you should paint. Okay, go ahead. So next slide, when Grant Wood went to Europe to find out about the stained glass making, he went into different museums, and one of the painters he saw was Hans Memling. This is not an Impressionist painting. This is much earlier than that. But he looked at that painting and he thought about his mother. Next picture. And you will see his mother, Hattie Wood, who was kind of in his imagination, and he's thinking, what kind of a costume would my mother be wearing if I was to paint her? Could you show Hattie Wood? Click. We're doing this just fine. It's all good. There she is. And from that idea of looking at how you have a costume, you have the person holding something that represents their interest in life, Grant Wood came up with, and there she is. This is his beginning of his modern mature style, an apron instead of that fancy kind of costume. He has her holding, the painting shows the time, the area around Anamosa, around Soch, and the plant end up in American Gothic as well. So we will go on to finding out about Grant Wood. Next picture. Grant Wood was born in 1891 to Hattie Weaver Wood and Francis Merville Wood. They lived on a farm just outside of Anamosa. Here's some pictures, next picture, of what Anamosa looked like in those days. In Grant Wood, that Holt's Opera House is exactly, that picture was taken the same year he was born. In Anamosa, Iowa, that's around the time that he was living there. They had a pretty good life, and it was very, very busy for them. They were farmers. They weren't very wealthy at all. And Then in 1901, next picture, a disaster struck when Francis Merville, Grant's father, died of a heart attack. This forced the family to move to Cedar Rapids. This was a big, big transition for this young boy. He was 10 years old, who was he was a dreamer. He wasn't the worker they wanted him to be, although he was a very hard worker on the farm, but he was always dreaming and always trying to draw and everything. And the family realized, he and his two brothers, and he had a baby sister, there was no way that they could hang on to this farm. So they ended up being forced to move to Cedar Rapids. And in my story, which starts actually with the death of his father, we have him actually taking a train after they sell their house and all their possessions. And I will read to you a few pages from my story. The Union Depot was a full city block in length. It had an elegant gabled roof and walls made of golden stone city stone. Grant thought it looked more like a country home of a king than an ordinary train station. Mr. Flynn drew his horse alongside several other wagons just as their approaching train was announced. Grant, Frank, and Jack ignored any unloading that was to be done, jumped out, and immediately ran to the platform. A deafening burst from the train's whistle sent Jack running, but Grant stood firm even when he felt the ground shake and heard the piercing squeal of brakes that declared the train's thundering arrival. "Just look at that engine," Frank gloated as if he had made the machine himself. "It's powerful enough to pull 15 tons. Grant stared in awe. The engine truly was a monster. Its wheels alone were taller than the engineers who ran it. "First train you've ever seen up close?" asked Mr. Flynn, who had joined them unnoticed. "Sure is, sir," Grant replied. "We've seen 'em plenty of times across the other side of the creek, but never close up." "Well, you boys better help me unload. It's a half hour before the train leaves, but time's sure going to go by quick as a wink." Grant felt a shiver of excitement at the idea that he'd actually be riding on a train in just half an hour. The benches, the walls, and even the curved ceiling inside the railway car were made of highly polished slats of wood. The seats, which were placed back to back, were connected with black enameled wrought iron. All this reminded Grant of the frames that connected the benches to the school desks back at Cottonwood School. Grant sat next to Ma, who held his still sleeping baby sister on her lap. His two brothers sat facing them, Jack with a rather silly-looking grin on his face, and Frank, who couldn't seem to stop talking. "See those men over there with their pocket watches out?" Frank asked as the train began moving. "That one is the station master. The one next to him is the engineer. They have to match up time on their watches with the station clock to be sure we're on schedule." How did Frank know all these things, Grant wondered. Go on. As the train picked up speed, the rhythmic sounds of wheels against the track seemed to soothe Ma. She was soon nodding off. So Grant pushed Frank's chatter to the back of his mind and stared out the window. He pretended the window was picture frame, and he was in some sort of a huge museum where all he had to do was sit while the paintings moved alongside him. The first painting he saw looked like a castle. A sign told him it was no castle, though. It was the Anamosa State Penitentiary. He'd heard of that place. It was filled with killers. One had killed his own mother when he was only 10 years old. As the train headed out of town, they passed a huge farm with buildings made of stone. Pa had told him of convicts working right out in the open. What if one of them managed to escape? What if he hopped on this very car? Grant gave a shiver. He recognized the next scene, a cemetery. This was even worse. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all, Grant mused. "That's where your pa is buried," Ma whispered, as if she'd awakened in time to say one last goodbye. Grant huddled close to her. Frank stopped talking. Even Nan let out a whimper. "Well," Ma broke the silence a short time later as they passed over the Wapsipinicon River. "We can't let Mrs. Abbott's chicken sandwiches go to waste now, can we?" "Cookies too?" asked Jack. "I'm hungry." Grant jumped up to pull the basket of food down from a shelf over their heads. Ma offered a prayer of thanks as Grant distributed the sandwiches and handed a cookie to Nan. "Dada," she said with a serious little face. Grant knew that Nan was just making sounds, but somehow she made him feel grown up. And when he saw how the simple words brought tears to Ma's eyes, he decided he'd take special care of both Ma and baby Nan from now on. And he did. Okay, go ahead. So these paintings in his mind turn into paintings as he thinks back about his childhood. And in the story, everything that I've written is based either on his very own words, because he started an autobiography that ends with just before he gets on that train. So, and then I did research on the trains and various things. And then when he arrives in Cedar Rapids, I'm using memories that are shared by his sister in a variety of books that she has given. And I read through scrapbooks that are saved and various things in archives. But it was really his own writing that got me started on, let's find out about his childhood. And in addition to the creation of an artist, if you click, you will see the other book that is available at Ice Cube Press, my first book, which is called Road to Wabiek. And this tells the story of J. Sigmund. I wasn't the only one in the world who didn't know who he was. And when I discovered who he was and the influence that he had on Grant Wood and Paul Engel, Steve mentioned Paul Engel. Paul does not show up in this story because he's much younger, but he was J. Sigmund's paperboy, and that's how Paul Engel got interested in poetry. So his story is fascinating, and it led me to learning about Grant Wood, and I think the two books are fascinating for reading. The Road to Wabiek was written for adults. The Creation of an Artist was written for children, but I think adults would find that interesting as well. And they're both available at Ice Cube Press. And Steve, I thank you so much for really following through. And you did listen to me. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you.
All right. While we bring Steve back up onto the screen, I wanted to take time to thank everybody. And now here is Steve.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, hey, you took the words right out of my mouth. I wanted to thank you and John and Rachel at the Iowa City Book Festival, City of Literature, for doing all this. You must be now become a keyboard or some sort of highly trained operators of this whole system. And anyway, I'm grateful for the Iowa City Book Festival and the City of Literature for hosting all this. We can go a little over an hour, and I had one question for each author, but I think the cool thing about being a book publisher all this time is you can kind of sense how I live. I can have a whole life just within the subjects of these books. I'm never bored. I can tell you that much. I'm learning from these people all the time. And Tom, are you? I'm assuming everyone's still here. I thought I'd just go through. Some ideas came to me, and I had some questions for each of you. I didn't have to think for David's because someone has one waiting for you. But Tom, I noticed, and this is kind of an unfair question, but I think in relationship to the Clubfoot, in your bio, you do have a mention there that you're into public health and global health expert. And well, I think that, right now we're in the midst of some global health issues, but I was just wondering if there's any sort of tie between Clubfoot and what we're going through now and just global health in general.
Well, good but tough question. I think,
it was an unfair question.
No. Global health is a broad area, and right now, of course, we're focusing on the infectious disease part of public health. But, it's always been said that if public health is doing their job, you don't even notice. The water you drink is clean, the air you breathe is okay, the food is safe, and all those areas. But public health also includes healthcare systems, and that is what's in place to not only fix people once they get sick, but to prevent illness, and that's really the goal of public health. So, in a sense, Clubfoot, the treatment of Clubfoot by treating an infant at a week or 10 days old, and by the time they're a couple months old, they're disability free, in the broadest sense, is public health. It's preventing a life of disability, a life of dependency. So there clearly is a connection. Let me mention one other little tidbit, is Dr. Ponseti was born in 1914. And in 1918, he lived on the island of Mallorca, a little Balearic island off of Spain, where he was born in the adjacent island. He lived through the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, 1919. And he recalled, as a 4-year-old, the carts coming through the streets picking up the bodies of the people who died during the Spanish flu epidemic. So there's certainly some tie there to public health that he experienced early on. So I won't give you a whole lecture on public health, but it is an incredibly broad area, and certainly one that's gotten all of our attention.
Right, and then I think that it's worth you just telling a little bit about how Rotary is involved in the in Clubfoot in general, because it's a useful tie to the whole book, I think. Sure.
Well, one of the issues with my wife's messing with the camera. Let go. One of the issues with Clubfoot is that it's a series of casts. So it's like orthodontics, but for your foot. So every week, the physician or the healthcare person does a little stretching of the foot, puts on a plaster cast, waits a week or so, 10 days, does a little more stretching. So progressively changes a deformed foot into a normal foot. That means that the parents have to bring the kid back to the clinic every week or every 10 days. There's travel involved. There's issues with other children. There's issues with buying the plaster, even though it may only cost $4 a roll in Africa. The nice thing about Rotary is we have 1.2 million Rotarians in communities all over the world, some 30,000 clubs. So they're on the ground and they can help change the stigma related to Clubfoot, that you don't have to squirrel these kids away and you don't have to be stuck with a life of disability, but also provide some of the logistical support of transportation and food for the kids and babysitting and other issues in terms of supporting the clinic. So Rotary seems to be, just like they've been the major player in eliminating polio and vaccinating kids all over the world, they're in a prime position to eliminate this disability, to, in a sense, vaccinate kids against the life of disability by seeing that they get treated as infants.
No, I mean, your book is the first thing that struck me is how necessary it is. Because, if someone's born and they don't know about this, then that's the problem right there, right?
Yep.
Just a lack of knowing. Okay, David, are you there? I'm assuming you are. Well, you're lucky because someone asked you. I've got a question waiting for you. You may have seen it already. But Elaine Mattingly says, my favorite Dickinson line is, why did they shut me out of heaven? Did I sing too loud? How did you arrive at the title for your book?
Damn it. Let's see here. I got lost somehow. What happened? Oh, okay.
There you are. We can hear and see you right now.
Okay, sorry about that. I wanted to mention also, just in passing it to Tom, one of the great characters in literature is Philip Carey in Somerset Maughams of Human Bondage, and he had a clubfoot, and that is what prompted me to be so very interested in Tom's book, because of course what Philip Carey had to go through was just unbelievable. But I just mentioned that. Okay, yes, the title comes from a poem called Meditation in the Color of Sea. And as we mentioned before, I been a lifelong Tchaikovsky scholar. And this poem actually has to do with the little bit of synesthesia that I have, particularly with Tchaikovsky, and that's being able to see colors with the music. And I've always been that way. So anyway, the poem is Meditation in the Color of C, and the line for the title comes from the final stanza. I want you to surrender to me. I may or may not love you, but it's necessary for you to believe that I do, so you can look into my eyes and see your unforgettable face reflected there as I do. So you will fall into us at this moment in a chorus of color and an incandescence of song. So this synesthesia there is the chorus of color, which is the voice of color, and then in a incandescence of song, in the living light of the song itself. So that's where the title comes from. And I fought Bruce over the title. I had another title.
I know.
I had another title, and because we were in publishing together for so long, I had the same argument with authors all the time. No, that title is not going to work. It just is not strong enough. So I said, okay, Bruce, you're right. So we went through a whole list of things of what we might use, and we ended up with I May or May Not Love You.
No, it's a good title. I think it's a perfect title. It makes you wonder and not wonder all at the same time, right? On an issue that you don't want to have too much wonder on, but yet is fascinating because it's full of wonder, right? Do you think you can take a request? Because you have someone on Twitter that really loves this poem of yours. If you turn your book to page 19, is there any chance you'd read Where I Wonder for us? I think I might have gotten shut off.
No,
are you
no.
there? Did you hear me?
Yeah,
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Okay. No, that's okay. But I know that...
the screen went wacky.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I guess that's my question, is whether you'll read that. And I'm putting you on the spot, of course. But I know that I loved her comment on Twitter. You can people can follow you at Balancement. And someone wrote, I love Where I Wonder. I think every single person can relate to it in every possible way. And when you hear someone give a comment like that, it immediately makes all of us want to hear what it's about and what it sounds like.
All right. Where I Wonder. So might it have gone had I done one small thing different. Had I said no, not now, or yes, please. Had I gone, had I stayed at home. If I had kissed this one and not that one. Had I decided to miss that train and took a later one. If I had not had one drink more, or had I not turned that one down. Had I, where those two roads diverged, decided to turn back instead and start all over again from where I knew I was and not gone down either, not caring where they were leading. Had I forgone that seemingly glittering opportunity where the golden ring hung temptingly from fortune's finger and passed on to see what other treasure might yet be uncovered? Had I let the fine bones of Paris seduce me? Had I met you halfway? Had I held you tighter? Had I let you drift away? Had I said something like, maybe, where then, I wonder, would we be?
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, that's great. You're definitely a poet. Bruce was very wise to encourage you, in my opinion. I know, because time doesn't last forever. We got to keep moving on. David Bluder, thanks for reading that. David Blooter, I'm thinking you're there somewhere in this virtual world of ours. Well, I had mentioned earlier in my comments, sort of the thing that's ruined sports for me is not knowing what's real and what's maybe being directed or produced on the court. I mean, what was the first thing that got you interested in this? And is that something that's ruined sports for you? I mean, you're really involved in college sports. I think he's there. Are you there, Dave? I will assume that you are not there, because I can't hear you. No problem. If he comes back in, I had another question. One of the things about his book, when I said it was fact and fiction in The Great Gatsby, is that you have this novel, and then he keeps having quotes from ESPN and New York Times that accurately portray what he's writing about. And then also one of Iowa's longtime representatives, James Leach, wrote a epilogue for the book, and he is really involved in gambling and trying to keep that out of sports. And it's a real eye opener to what we would like to call, what we tend to call fiction, even though, like I said, it's not fiction at all. Barb, I'm going to see if you're still there.
I am.
Oh, okay, perfect. David Blooter, if you log in, I've got those 2 questions memorized, so I'll ask them to you again. But Barb, I was going to ask you if when you, and this might be me just not knowing any better, but when you did the J. Sigmund book, you sort of had all sorts of people coming to you that had known him or are related to him. And I'm curious if you've ever had anything like that happen with Grant Wood. And once again, I don't even know if that's possible, but I'm just curious if you've had anyone say, "Oh, I knew Grant," or I had some sort of tie to him.
I absolutely did. Thank you for asking that question. It started out, of course, with Jason Sigmund's family, because they were the ones I was meeting when I was doing research on J. Sigmund. And then as I ended up working at 5 Turner Alley, which is Grant Wood's studio, and it's a very small, basically a large room, but a small house, and it's the hayloft of an old carriage house that was on the property of Turner's mortuary, which is one of the very first funeral parlors in the country. And older people would come up those stairs, rickety stairs. This is a hayloft, really, to tell me stories and share them about Grant Wood. And it was fabulous to hear them. And but the person who influenced me the most for writing this book would be Joanie Kinsey, who was giving talks on Grant Wood, because when I was working there, it was a time when American Gothic and many, many, many other works by Grant Wood, other than paintings, were there. And so we had a whole series of speakers, and I got to meet those speakers, and they became authors or were already authors writing about Grant Wood. But Joanie Kinsey in her talk mentioned that the University of Iowa had this autobiography that was unfinished, and said I could get a hold of it. And it turned out that this autobiography of his ended when he was age 10, moving to Iowa. Or moving to Cedar Rapids, I mean. So that's, yes, definitely.
Yeah, I heard you. It was a little choppy at first, but it's sort of, yeah, we could hear you okay. It was, okay. We lost the first 10 seconds, but, that's the way it is in this world.
Because I kept seeing this thing circling and circling around, and it made me wonder what was happening. Okay.
No, I see Dave Bluder's on the screen again, so I'm going to circle back around to him. Did you, I don't know if,
all right, and I'll.
I don't know if you heard me the first time, Dave, but I was wondering. I'd mentioned earlier that the thing about sports that I'd always liked the most is that I was always under the impression, apparently, as it turns out, that sports were this real life thing happening as you watched it. But I mean, do you think that's even a reasonable assumption on any of our parts to watch a game like that anymore?
I think there are an enormous amount of, I'm getting some feedback here, enormous amount of misdirection and possible infusion of what people want to do with a specific game based upon prop bets, how long the national anthem is going to take to sing, how many points somebody's going to score, not necessarily the outcome of games. And I spoke to Michael Franzese, who was in Goodfellas, and he said they were doing this, and they've been doing this in New York City for dozens of years. And there's actually a lot of data about how he's done this and how certain people have allowed them to kind of coordinate and change games, for example, by persons, by referees. And then 10 years ago, there was a guy by the name of Tim Donaghy, and he was in the NBA, and he was an NBA referee. He changed games, and then the NBA found out that he was changing those games, and he said there was about 9 or 10 others that were doing the same thing, and the NBA covered that up. So Francis said it's happening in every sport. Tennis is a big one, football, baseball, basketball. I said the only ones they really didn't deal in much was hockey. So, and now with the amount of dollars that are coming in, it's just happening everywhere.
Yeah, it almost makes you wonder if you're watching I mean, I guess the question is whether that, I mean, we know that umpires and the refs can get involved, but I guess the players obviously are getting something out of it too, right? I've mentioned that 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 you've written a novel, but in some ways you haven't written a novel at all, right? And I think one way of demonstrating that is that you have Jim Leach, former Congressman Jim Leach, writing an epilogue to it, and I mean, he's not writing about a novel at all. He's talking about the reality of the book that you wrote, and
Right.
maybe the best way to write your book was a novel. I don't know. I mean, do you have any comments on Jim, and then maybe maybe this is the only way to write this story?
Well, Jim has been fighting this for a long time. He tried to create I'm getting feedback again. Tried to create a law. He did create a law. With Senator Bill Bradley, who actually ran for president under the Democratic ticket a few years ago. They tried to stop this. Bill played for the New York Knicks. He also went to the Final Four, was Player of the Year, Naismith Player of the Year at Princeton. So brilliant. Both of them are brilliant people, and both of them are trying to change this and stop this from happening. So a lot of this was happening overseas, and through credit cards and through the internet. And so Jim created a law to stop credit card payments through the internet for gambling. And it held up for a while. And as soon as he left office, it was overturned. So there's just so much money involved. You talk to everybody in any sports, and it's pretty scary stuff. And you talk to the greatest wrestling coach and probably wrestler of all time, Dan Gable, and he says it's been going on in the Olympics for dozens and dozens of years. So it's pretty scary and frightening stuff. But we try to portray what could happen and what possibly will happen in the future from all this, and that's where the novel kind of comes in.
Right. It's a good way to tell it. Well, we've gone a little over an hour, but I guess maybe I don't know if we want to go through the order and just everyone say a final parting word for a minute or two. That might be appropriate. Start with Tom and work our way through.
Well, my only word would be thanks to those of you who took the time on a beautiful Saturday afternoon to tune in and hear about these, our literary works. It certainly, as an author, there's a big investment of time, and it's nice to have people that appreciate what you do. And I'd like to say a special thanks to Steve, who had the faith in many of us as first-time authors to give us a chance to share what we think is an important message for everybody else. So thank you, Steve, and thanks to the Iowa City Book Festival for hosting this event.
Absolutely. Yeah, David Perkins.
Damn it.
We
Why
heard
does this
that.
thing do that all the time?
You're
There.
fine. We can hear you. We can hear
Sorry.
you fine.
All right.
Okay.
Listen, what I want to say is, speaking of gambling, I was in publishing for 30, 35 years, I think. And people don't realize that what publishing is gambling. A brave publisher thinks he has something, invests in it, and then is gambling that others are going to take an interest in it. And so, bravo to the publishers and to Steve. Thank you, sir.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, my daughter keeps asking me when I'm going to have the New York Times bestseller. I say, hey, I'd just be happy with 100,000 copies sold at this point. But I explained to her how that's not the point. It's just not about that. If it was, I'd be in the wrong profession. Well, Dave, Blooter, this is your chance for parting words.
Steve, all of you, cancel that Las Vegas vacation. Gambling is now legal in 20 states and all over with your phones and your internet, so you can do it all over. So, again, thanks for gambling on me.
Yeah. All right, Barb.
Well, thank you all. This was just great to be able to meet you online and to see you and to hear your books. This is terrific. It really was terrific. Thank you very, very much.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. And I'm under the understanding, and I've done this already myself, is that you can go back and have people watch this again. It's being archived and it is available immediately, because we had James Autry, one of our authors, on the 5th, and I've been able to go back and watch that. So anyway, thanks, everybody. I haven't seen some of you in a long time, so it's nice to see you again. And I guess the best thing you can do is read these people's books. You can get them at Amazon and Prairie Lights and area and independent bookstores all over the country, as well as going directly to the website and ordering there. And if you make a request that you'd want one signed, guess what? We can probably figure out how to do that. All right. Thanks, John. And